Here are the differences between the British and American editions of Rainbow Magic number 16, Melodie the Music Fairy. The British edition is the one that came first. In the opening illustration, the sweet shop becomes the candy shop. In the opening poem, to celebrate becomes will celebrate, jubilee becomes anniversary, have they becomes they have, all fairyland becomes all of fairyland, shine your wand becomes pull out your wand, press your dress becomes fanciest dress. HRH, meaning Her Royal Highness, is removed from Fairy Godmother's name. Chapter 1. The page numbering is different. The UK version starts on page 9, while the US version starts on page 1. A brilliant dancer becomes an amazing dancer. With becomes when I'm with. Tonight with becomes tonight when I'm with. The proper costumes becomes everyone is in costume. Till becomes until, lovely becomes beautiful, special occasion becomes very special occasion, is decorating becomes decorated, organizing becomes is organizing, jubilee becomes anniversary, fairy king and queen becomes fairy king and queen's rule, it was meant to be becomes it would, cunningly is removed from he had cunningly sent, spoil becomes ruin, and grab becomes then they would grab, set things right becomes set things straight. Then fairy magic becomes Jack Frost wanted the fairy magic. Would make becomes to make, but the becomes without magic then. Jubilee becomes anniversary. Celebrations becomes celebration. Mum becomes mom. Some cakes becomes cupcakes. Fairy cakes becomes cupcakes here and everywhere else in the book. Rachel laughed becomes Rachel said. Tucking the tin under her arm becomes carefully taking the tin. They arrived becomes when they arrived. To find it already full becomes it was already full. Several rows of chairs becomes rows of chairs. Fairy lights becomes Christmas lights. Chatted to becomes chatted with. The cakes becomes they. Cakes becomes treats. Tying becomes they tied. Hadn't heard about the ballet school party becomes hadn't heard about the ballet school party after all. Having seen Kirsty practice becomes she'd seen Kirsty practice, so she watched in delight is removed. The girls looked becomes the girls all looked. Gauzy tutus becomes tulle tutus. But then suddenly becomes but suddenly. Have difficulty becomes have trouble. They were dancing on bravely becomes they kept dancing. Stubbing becomes they stubbed. Pirouette becomes spin and leap. And the tune becomes soon the tune. Now is removed from was now just. Red in the face is removed. One after the other is removed. Quicker and quicker becomes more and more quickly. Keep to the beat becomes keep up with the music. What's wrong with it becomes what's wrong. Goblins becomes sneaky goblins. Chapter 2. Abandon their performance becomes stop dancing. To see what was going on is removed from rushed off stage to see what was going on. Goblin mischief becomes the work of goblins. Said to herself becomes said under her breath. Round becomes around. Could hide becomes might hide. And becomes plus. Pantomime becomes performance. To start her search becomes to start looking. And one of them becomes one of the instruments. All the other instruments were still becomes none of the other instruments were moving. What was making it tremble becomes what would make it shake like that. And set it moving is removed. Still be lurking becomes still be. As quietly as she could becomes quietly. Crept towards becomes tiptoed toward. Carefully is removed from looking around carefully. To be sure is removed from she wanted to be sure to spot him. The sentence starting with but she is split into two sentences at the word so, which is removed. The word tinkling is removed from tinkling tambourine. The rim becomes it. So is removed from as she did so. Glow flooded becomes light glowed. Out from underneath becomes from under the rim. Eagerly is moved ahead 4 words. Away becomes all the way. The sentence starting with she had already is split into 2 sentences at the word and, which is removed. Tucked away with her face buried in her gauzy skirt becomes with her face buried in her hands. Was a tiny shimmering fairy becomes a tiny shimmering fairy was sitting there. Tears like diamonds becomes her tears shimmered in the light like diamonds as they, as she adjusted her little gold headband, is moved to after she sniffed. As a result, sadly is removed from she sniffed sadly. That's right becomes that's right. Stood up on tiptoe becomes stood on tiptoe. Pink ballet dress becomes pink dress. All around becomes around. Plaits becomes braids. Had made it go wrong becomes was to blame. For the girls' ballet becomes for the ballet. Jubilee becomes anniversary. Chapter 3. Eagerly is removed from she cried eagerly. Towards becomes toward. Silvery is removed from soft silvery voice. Pleased becomes happy. Gratefully is removed from Kirsty said gratefully. She gasped becomes she groaned. Enthusiastically becomes eagerly. Thought about this becomes thought for a moment. Hang around there becomes risk hanging around there. Easily is removed from slip away easily. Corridor becomes hallway. Cupboards becomes closets. Rummaged becomes searched. Look under becomes check under. Peered out of the window becomes looked out the window. The three becomes the three friends. Corridor becomes hallway. Downhearted becomes glum. Glumly is removed from Rachel asked glumly. Not with so many people around becomes he wouldn't have gotten out with so many people around. He's hiding becomes he must be hiding. Listening hard becomes listening closely. With a party going on becomes when a party's going on. Pulling a face becomes making a face. She gasped becomes she cried. The sentence starting with only a goblin is split into two sentences at the word and, which is removed. Towards becomes toward. Door ajar becomes door cracked open. Peeped becomes peaked. Astonishment becomes surprise. Chapter 4. Puzzled becomes confused. And playing becomes he could be playing. Let's go and look becomes let's all go and look. I'll go becomes let me go. Grand piano becomes piano. A nasty-looking goblin becomes a tiny, nasty-looking goblin. Knobbly is removed from knobbly hand. Pranced becomes ran. Party bag becomes fairy's bag. Ever so gently becomes very gently. Rachel and Melody becomes her friends. Grand piano becomes piano. This gave becomes they gave. A clever idea becomes an idea. Might hear you becomes might hear you coming. A shower of glittering fairy dust floated down around Rachel becomes a cloud of glittering fairy dust showered down on Rachel. Sparkling is removed from the sparkling dust. Herself is removed from as Melody herself. Set off becomes flitted. Quickly is removed from quickly they flew. Bewilderment becomes confusion. Very same moment becomes same moment. And with becomes with. Chapter 5. Dreadful becomes horrible. My poor head hurts becomes my head aches. And he leapt becomes he jumped. Rachel smiled to herself becomes Rachel smiled. The cymbals had made a deafening noise, she thought, becomes she agreed that the cymbals had made a deafening noise. The sentence starting with she heard a smaller is split into two sentences at the word and, which becomes when. Looked round becomes looked around. To see that becomes she saw that. Snatch up becomes grab. I've got my party bag becomes I have my party bag back. Peeped becomes peaked. As she did so becomes as she did. Golden is removed from glittering golden music notes. Corridor becomes hallway. Let the lid down becomes put the lid down. Whatever becomes what. They change Kirsty's stammering noises. Becomes and becomes Moment becomes minute. The sentence, what would they do? Is added to the end of the chapter. It's very dramatic. Chapter 6. Had gone becomes had left. And with becomes with. Shower becomes burst. Then clutching becomes holding. Speeded up music becomes super fast music. Somehow becomes after all. However is removed. Large becomes big. Peering becomes peeking. Melody hissed becomes Melody asked. She edged a little closer becomes she edged a little closer to watch. Peeped becomes peaked. But though becomes but even though. Racked her brains becomes racked her brain. She looked round becomes Rachel looked around. Notion becomes thought. The sentence starting with they couldn't be is split into two sentences at the word but, which is removed. They couldn't be seen becomes no one could see them. Slipped across becomes snuck over. She was pleased becomes she was happy. There was nobody else about becomes there wasn't anybody else around. Round here becomes right here. Then she flitted becomes flitting. Throwing becomes Melody threw. Flourish becomes twirl. Stroking becomes moving across. The word quivering is removed. While the strings of a harp were plucked by invisible fingers becomes while it seemed like invisible fingers plucked the strings of a harp. That there becomes that this. as the girls rushed onto the stage becomes the girls rushed onto the stage and. Dancing around becomes dancing, musical notes becomes music notes, and then becomes then, except for Kirsty, who becomes Kirsty on the other hand. Jubilee becomes anniversary party. Any more becomes more. Melody beamed becomes Melody blew them each a kiss. The sentence starting with good luck is split into two sentences at the word and, which is removed. The sentence starting with oh, I'm sure is split into two sentences at the word and, which is removed. She smiled becomes she grinned. That is about 212 changes in a 63-page book, making 3.33333 repeating changes per page.